We have three speakers here. I'll read out the topics also on which they are going to speak and the topics in which they are experts. One is Professor K.K. Basa. He doesn't need any introduction. I suppose everybody we know him here. And I personally know him for a long, long time. He'll be speaking on anthropology, museum, and sustainable future. Anthropology, museum, and sustainable future. Then the second speaker, his title of his lecture is very exciting to me also. Maritime anthropology, at least to my knowledge. Yesterday only I met him and I knew on what topic he's been going to speak. Maritime anthropology, I confess, I had not heard earlier. Maybe some works might have been done all over the world, something maybe it may have been done, but I was unaware of it. So maritime anthropology and SDG, that is Sustainable Development Goal 14, isn't it? This is the whole title. Maritime Anthropology and Sustainable Development Goals number 14, Assessment, Academics and Advocacy for Development of Fisheries in India. This is on which Professor P. Vijay Prakash will be speaking. And the third is Professor S. Gregory. Rationalizing affirmative action. His topic is rationalizing affirmative action for ensuring equity and social justice. Must be very thought-provoking, I believe. Now, without taking any time more, I would request the first speaker, Professor K.K. Basa, to deliver his lecture on anthropology, museum, and sustainable future. Professor Basa, please.
The presentation is on anthropology, museum, and sustainable future. There are three aspects of this lecture: meanings and background, changing perspectives in anthropology and museum, and then linkage of anthropology, museum, and sustainable future. Of course, I mean, as far as the meanings are concerned, all of you know anthropology to begin with, it's a colonial construct in India to study the other from the vantage point of the colonial master. Simply, it's a biocultural study of human beings and society in time and space. But then, to me, the most important aspect, culture is the hallmark of anthropology. With regard to museum, it's a colonial construct in India. But then recently, in 2022, ICOM has prepared a definition. There's a new definition of the museum. A museum is not a non-profit, permanent institution in the service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage. This is important. Open to the public, accessible and inclusive. Museums fosters diversity and sustainability. So sustainability is a very important part of the definition of museum. They operate and communicate ethically, professionally with the participation of communities, offering varied experiences for education, employment, reflection, and knowledge sharing. So this is the most comprehensive definition of museum that has been prepared by ICOM in 2022. In Europe, it was inspired by the back-looking curiosity of the Renaissance. Princes and aristocrats had cabinets of curiosities, which became the precursors to museum. And by early 19th century, the British Museum in London, that is 1753, this became the foreground knowledge-producing institutions of the empire. And by mid-19th century, Europe, museums of distinct fields of separate disciplines of knowledge have come. There are different purposes, classical learning, mechanical utility, so on and so forth. Museum in India, it was started as a repository of natural, historical and cultural objects. Mind you, Geological Survey of India came in 1851, Archaeological Survey of India came in 1961. So the museum, Indian Museum was the repository of different surveys, including samples of material culture of the Ada. Museum is the institutional homeland of anthropology, but then it took some time for anthropology to find that homeland. But Stocking very appropriately says modern museums are secular temples and are distinctly material. With regard to sustainability, you know what is sustainability? The practice of meeting present-day needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, often by balancing environmental protection, social equity, and economic viability. So the key aspects are the environmental sustainability, social sustainability, economic sustainability. In essence, sustainability is about living in balance with the planet, ensuring a healthy and prosperous future for everyone. Now, another term which is very important for us is the term Anthropocene. Used in F. Stoermer in 1980s, he used in an informal manner, but atmospheric chemist Paul Cruzen gave a formal sort of use in 2000 in Mexico. And there are three stages of Anthropocene. The stage 1 from 1800 to 1945, it's called the Industrial Era. Stage 2 from 1945 to 2015, it's called the Great Acceleration. But now we are living in the third stage, which may now be starting when people have become aware of the extent of the human impact and may thus start stewardship of the earth system. Because this is the generation which is very much conscious of the impact of various industrialization or industrial evolution, and we must take care of the planet. Blaming capitalism for the global predicament, the environmental historian Jason Moore developed a more controversial concept called Capitalocene in 2016, because the overuse of resources, the relentless search for profitability, the translation of nature into quantifiable resources, and the commitment to endless growth, according to her, are nothing but a particular phase in our recent history and are not the characteristics of humanity. She says that, well, this is a particular phase. It's not necessarily the most important characteristics of our humanity. When you think from a long-term perspective. Arguing that we cannot dwell in the Anthropocene, Doana Haraway, Professor Patnaik was making a reference to her, has proposed a move towards what she called the Chulutscene. And this is an imagined future where humans finally learn to live as a part of the earth, rather than dominating it, and which refers to the entanglements of ultimately all living species in a web of life. Thus, hers is not a call for a return to a pure and uncontaminated world, but explores ways of staying with the trouble. Now, let us discuss very briefly relation between anthropology and museum. Both are colonial constructs. Relics of material culture were kept as specimens in museums and used as examples to validate the theory of evolution and diffusion, the 19th century evolutionism and the first part of 20th century diffusion theory. But because of the ahistorical nature of the theory of structural functionalism, museum went to the margins, to the extent that questions were raised, does anthropology need museums? With the changing perspectives in anthropology and museum studies, museum has come to the center stage of anthropological discourse, unlike the phase of structural functionalism. Now, with regard to changing perspectives in anthropology, we know globalization has impacted. So what is the relationship between globalization and culture? One issue is whether globalization is leading to homogenization of culture, or globalization leads to celebration of diversity. That's an issue. Global-local relationship is another issue. And various scapes of the famous anthropologist Arjun Napadurai, ethnoscape, mediascape, there are 5 scapes he talked about. Another aspect of changing perspective is the post-colonial theory, which contextualized colonial stereotypes and also interrogated colonial stereotypes. Autoethnography has emerged in various parts of the world, especially in Northeast India, to challenge that stereotypical colonial narratives. So another issue is sustainable development, development from below, alternative development. These are also important changing perspectives of anthropology. Ethnicity and identity politics is another important aspect of the changing perspective in anthropology. Coming to museum, the changing perspectives basically includes the emergence of new museology as an important discourse. New museology basically meant that it is the voice of the community is to be heard in museum. That is the primacy. It is no longer the curator as the sole custodian of cultural heritage was successfully challenged in the discourse of new museology, and it was believed that it is the community whose voice is ultimate as far as the museum is concerned, and the role of the curator is in terms of facilitating that process. So the curator there is a steady erosion of the arrogance of the curator as the sole custodian of heritage. Rather, it is the community, its community's voice, it is the collective wisdom of the community is to be emphasized in new museology. Now, that is what Patrick Boylan discusses in his features of new museology. Anna Laura Jones makes 2 points. First, academic anthropologists rarely consider museum anthropology as an important area for the employment of anthropologists. Second, museum anthropologists now practice in a highly politicized public setting, put current theory into practice in interesting ways. The new atmosphere of relevance and accountability, a change from the isolation and triviality of past decades, making museum environment as dynamic and challenging an arena for anthropology as the halls of the academia. So, now, as far as the anthropology museums are concerned, they are redefining their role in promoting a sustainable future by moving beyond the static preservation towards dynamic community engagement and a focus on indigenous knowledge and climate action. This shift addresses critics about the fields of colonial past and its separation of culture and nature to foster more just, inclusive, and culturally sustainable societies. As far as the key roles of the anthropology museums in promoting sustainability are concerned, another important factor is elevating indigenous knowledge system. By doing so, they not only support indigenous sovereignty over traditional knowledge, but also model a more holistic, culturally sensitive approach to sustainability for a wider audience. Then also driving climate action. As institutions of non-formal education, museums can amplify climate change education and inspire action. They can host community-led research and action hubs focused on climate solutions. They can showcase innovations that rethink the human-environment relationship, and they can lead by example through their own operational practices, such as reducing waste, energy, and consumption. Encouraging cultural sustainability is another important aspect museums can do. Museums have a vital role in protecting cultural heritage and fostering cultural vitality. This can be achieved by preserving and promotion of both tangible and intangible cultural heritage, enabling cultural participation, creating dialogue that helps communities navigate the complexities of globalization and culture change, decolonizing museum practices by critically examining their colonial legacies and rectifying historical injustice. Now, decolonization involves a number of aspects as far as museum is concerned. One important thing is repatriating ancestral remains and cultural objects. That has started happening. The skeletal remains from different museums in the West are going back to Australia and in Africa. Challenging a Western-centric worldview and promoting diverse perspectives, adopting participatory practices in curatorial design. That means it is no longer that the curator will design, it is the community and curator together. They can curate exhibitions. Digitizing collections, which with an implication for sustainable solutions for collections management by improving accessibility for global audiences. Museum Indigenous Community Climate Action Partnership. This is driven by mutual respect, knowledge sharing, and indigenous leadership. There are examples throughout the world, different approaches from co-curating climate stories to using indigenous knowledge for conservation and resilience. An example is Australian Museum and the Pacific Climate Warriors. The Australian Museum collaborated with the Pacific Climate Warriors and Pacifica communities in Sydney to co-curate the exhibition One Salt Ocean Gallery. The project uses cultural objects and powerful video storytelling to discuss climate change. It links climate stories with cultural identity and histories of resistance, connecting the Pacific diaspora to broader climatic action group. Botswana National Museum in Africa works with local communities through its outreach program, a Zebra on the Move, educates school children on cultural and environmental issues by sharing indigenous methods of conservation and sustainability. By preserving indigenous knowledge alongside Western concepts, the initiative instills environmental awareness and shows how traditional practices can mitigate the impacts of consumer-driven economy. Then the Maasai Peat Rivers Museum Living Cultures Partnership between UK and East Africa, a long-line collaboration between the Peat Rivers Museum at the University of Oxford and the Maasai people of East Africa, facilitated by the NGO Insights Here. This partnership, shaped by the Maasai, uses participatory video to empower the community to tell their own stories about threats to their territory and livelihoods. The videos serve as a platform for the Maasai to communicate critical issues such as land loss to national parks and climate pressures, bypassing traditional forms and intermediation. Indigenous-led climate action, which is a global one, the United Nations FCCC, according to these organizations, many indigenous-led climate actions are happening, though not always directly in partnership with museums. And these can be prime examples of the knowledge systems that museums can also amplify. And these could include using agroforestry in the eastern Himalayas of India, revitalizing traditional agricultural and aquaculture technology in the Pacific, adopting the ancient milpa farming system in Mexico, building climate resilient energy system in the Arctic. Now, these partnerships are supposed to be successful because they center the experiences and knowledge of indigenous communities, moving beyond simply displaying artifacts. They treat museums as active platforms for indigenous-led climate research, community building, and advocacy, ultimately fostering more just and culturally sustainable futures. Now, Henry McGee, in 2019, he prepared a guide how museums can support the sustainable development goals. And according to him, this can be achieved by safeguarding cultural and natural heritage, providing learning opportunities, fostering cultural participation for all, supporting sustainable tourism, enabling SDG-focused research, and directing their internal and external leadership, operations, and partnership towards the goals, and also emphasizes the role of museums in contributing to local economies, promoting fair societies through accessible services. He proposed a six-step plan and 7 key activities relevant to most museums, museum workers, networks, funders, and other stakeholders. There are 2 types, some directly linked to anthropology as a discipline, and some others emerge with challenging concepts with anthropological perspectives. Now, as far as India is concerned, I will discuss 3 critics, basically 3 by 3 authorities on as regards museums in India. This is T.C. Das, Tarak Chandra Das, 1943. I convey my sincere thanks to Professor Abhijit Ghosh for drawing my attention to Dr. T.C. Das. For him, museum, it should play a role in the development of people instead of being more or less depositor of curious. Mind you, he writing in 1943. Your new museumology discourse is coming in 70s and 80s. And he talks of 3 types of museum: historical, artistic, and economic. He says that it's historical and art museums are given priority in India, but he thinks that the importance of economic museums should be more. And he's giving a radical idea that India is a poor country where, and therefore, the museums should carry their exhibits to the very doors of the people instead of asking them to come to the museums. That's a very radical statement he's making in 1943. Because to him, economic museums should bring knowledge about the existing means and methods of agriculture, commerce, and industries in different parts of the country in the first instance, and then of the outside world in concrete shape to the people who are mostly in need of it. So he is asking for a direct community engagement with museums as early as 1943. And he's talking of network of 3 different varieties of museums: central museums, local museums, and circuit museums. And these circuit museums are to move from place to place. Circuit museums were to be organized by the authorities of the central museums in close cooperation with the local museums. For him, the museum motto should be, it exists for the people, not scientists alone. The next is Kalyan Chakrabarti, and he says museums in India cannot adopt the ostrich-like policy of turning their backs on a biological, genetic, and molecular and cultural reductionism. Museums were unable to attract broad community interest because the collections and activities are unable to break out of the colonial mental mold and transcend their current role of being old curiosity shops. At the worst, the museums thus became teleological agents of the destruction of the communities. According to him, the survival of the identity of rural communities is crucial to the survival of Indian identity and about the relevance of the museum project. The last is Roman Lakshmi, 2017. And she makes very good phrases about making a critique of museums in India, especially archaeological museums. An immobilizing crisis of imagination, trapped in an unsparing sameness, beautiful objects displayed indifferently, lack of storytelling, social context or powerful experiences, a complete and unforgivable apathy towards visitor comfort, learning or entertainment. The unspoken rhetorical code of our museum landscape is collect it, display it, and forget it. Civilizational arrogance and ennui, because we are a rich civilization, we have got many objects, so we don't mind, we just sort of display the objects without bothering anything else. Now, as far as India is concerned, C emphasizes the disruptive changes in the communities, ecology and livelihoods, and therefore our museum should address the difficult social, environmental and cultural anxieties that inevitably follow such transition. And I'll be discussing certain examples how this has been done in some of the museums in India. In a democracy like India, arguments are in a political arena or in the media, but C thinks that the challenge is how to radically reimagine museum as a more constructive, contemplative platform for contested issues. Now let me give some examples. IGRMS is there, Professor Pandey is there. So all of you know about IGRMS, but then only a few things I would like to say. IGRMS, it promotes national integration not by homogenizing culture, but by celebrating cultural diversity. The distinction between tangible and intangible is treated as a heuristic devices. IGRMS does not romanticize the traditional knowledge system in a changeless, essential entity, but rather tries to bring out the elements of culture as an input in sustainable development. The two examples I can give, one, their emphasis on traditional water management, and then also the question of sacred groves. Sacred groves as a more traditional mode of conserving biodiversity, that has been highlighted by IGRMS, not only it's in open air exhibition, but also in traveling exhibition as well. They also deal with vulnerable sections of the society, identity, gender, and all kinds of things they do in IGRMS. This is the tribal habitat on the left and right in the indoor museum. And what is important is in the open air display, you will find that the eco-specific, the adaptation of habitat in terms of ecology. So they have tribal habitat, they have coastal village, they have desert village, and how the habitats have adapted to the ecology. Now, there is a very radical museum that is called Remember Bhopal Museum that was set up in 2014 in Bhopal. It is India's first museum that tells the story of a contemporary event and a social movement. A team of survivors, activists, and academics and museum professionals have done it. This is the first museum in India that has not accepted a single rupee from either the government or any corporation, both of whom are regarded as the guilty in their eyes, because this is related to the Bhopal gas tragedy in 1984. This tells the story of trauma of 1984 Union Carbide gas link in Bhopal, where 4,000 people died in first few days and 14,000 local residences. Many people were affected in the process. This is related to, there is no general consensus. Sorry. क्या हो गया? Could you please come? I'm not that tech savvy. Okay, इसको हाँ हो गया ना? हाँ, sorry. I'll take 3-4 minutes, not more than that. I'll finish it. Next. So this is a place. It is both a place of story and storyteller. There is, they start with the experience and then put the objects there. So the narrative foreground people rather than the object. So it is meant to be a safe, usually meant to be a safe and empowering space, but then it does not force survivors to abandon their anger. People can come and express their feelings. The museum appears to be a fluid and dynamic site. Many survivors who visited the museum had left in tears. This is a very interesting museum in Bhopal. This is the Remember Bhopal Museum. This is again Remember Bhopal Museum. Now another is Peace Museum in Imphal. This is a commemoration of the Platinum Jubilee of the Battle of Imphal, the opening of the Imphal Peace Museum in 2019. You know, the Imphal became where both the Japanese forces and the British forces fought, and the Peace Museum came in 2019. It stands for reconciliation, peace, a tribute to the soldiers and civilians who have lost their lives, narrates the experience of the Manipuris during the war, the impact of the war on the society of the Manipuris and their culture, their resilience, and how the Manipuris have moved beyond. The commemorative program witnessed the visit of dignitaries both from United Kingdom and Japan at the battleground of Maibam Lora Ching, known as the Red Hill. This is the Peace Museum in Imphal. And this is the last gallery where the textile represents all the communities of Manipur. So it shows a kind of cultural integration. Bhacha Museum, Tezgad, Gujarat. This Bhacha means voice, the speech or expression. It is in Tezgad in Gujarat. It regarded as the museum of the Adivasi people, representing the voice of the Adivasis. It emerged from an experiment, but there is an emphasis on process of self-reliance rather than achieving quantitative success. Now, this is a center, the museum is the centerpiece of the academy. It's the largest collection of Adivasi art, especially the Pithora paintings, largest collection of resource literature on Indian tribes. There is an open museum of languages. This is very interesting. What is known as Bhasa Bona, forest of languages, where each tree, through the use of sensor, speaks a different language. That's a very interesting aspect. A photo archive of about 60,000 images with Adivasi objects received from German and British museums, an exhibition symbolizing a move towards decolonization of Adivasi culture. Purva Prakash, the first community-owned publishing program of the Adivasis, a magazine called Dhol. This is very interesting. A magazine called Dhol, that's a drum in a few tribal languages intended to be read out loud rather than for individual reading. You see, we read a journal, but that's a kind of, many people will be reading that. So that is another way of displaying community knowledge. An Adivasi craft cooperative, Bhacha is self-made and not a notable expression of Adivasi gaze. This is Bhacha Museum. Sorry. These are Bhacha Museum's slides. The Museum of Voice and Adivasi Academy, a laboratory for contemporary ethic, anthropological and artistic studies carried out from the perspective of the Adivasis. Now to conclude, anthropology and museum have moved from their being colonial constructs providing legitimacy to the colonial rule to engage themselves in encountering with the challenges of globalization, post-colonialism, as well as Anthropocene on the one hand, and playing a critical as well as a creative role for a sustainable future on the other. This has been made possible by the changing perspectives and paradigm shifts in both anthropology and museum studies, resulting in the museum being brought into the center stage of anthropological discourse. This has made the practice of anthropology and museum a dynamic one by celebrating dissenting imagination as well as promoting the best practices of indigenous knowledge as sources for alternative development and processes of decolonization. Needless to say, all these throw challenge to the privileged nature of the Western knowledge system and have a definite bearing for a sustainable future. Thank you. This is not my personal view, and this is not the view of the National Monuments Authority. And
Thank you.
I acknowledge, because I represent a government, therefore I must confess that. That's the disclaimer. And I convey my deep sense of gratitude to Director IJRMS and his staff, because I availed Tagore Nationalship from them, and much of this work is from as a Tagore National Fellow.
Thank you, Professor Basa. This has been very thought-provoking lecture that you have given. Even in my mind, some of the things which I wanted to discuss with you, but time doesn't allow, I think, because the session was already for 1 hour, and we have 2 more speakers whom we have to listen to. After they have completed, the 2 other speakers, after they have completed their presentation, then for some time we can have some discussion on any of the 3, isn't it? Okay? I'll take 2 minutes. See, the point is, the major problem of the colonial legacy of museum is that what is the important aspects of colonial ethnography? To me, there are 2 aspects of colonial ethnography. One is either they romanticized colonial the colonial administrators, either they romanticized tribal cultures
or they poured venom against tribal cultures, that, these are uncivilized, barbar, and needs to be civilized. Therefore, the civilizing mission, therefore. So now, in a post-independent India and with a post-colonialism emerging as an important theoretical discourse, the paradigm shift has taken place. You cannot treat our tribal groups as uncivilized, barbarians, needs to be developed. One has to understand that sensitivity, that their knowledge system is also an important form of knowledge system. So therefore, the post-colonial museums like IGRMS and all things, they come with that perspective, that it is not that we have to teach them. It is that sometimes you have to learn from them. And that paradigm shift is taking place in institutions like IGRMS, in Bhanja, or in some other places. There are other museums. I just gave 3 or 4 museums. So therefore, there is a paradigm shift. And this paradigm shift is challenging the privileged nature of Western knowledge system. We are not saying that whatever tribal knowledge system is there, that our traditional knowledge system is absolutely good. But the point is, now it is the time we have accepted that it is an important form of knowledge system. Maybe that on the basis of scientific study, you can make some value addition to it. That aspect is open. For example, I am giving a very important example of what Professor Pandey has been doing also, the tribal healers workshop. Now, we invite tribal healers from different parts of the country. Now, tribal healers claim many big things, that I can cure cancer, I can this thing. So it is not that we accept whatever they are saying, but we are giving IGRMS is giving a platform that you cannot ignore this knowledge system. If you may go for scientific verification or validation of this knowledge system, but you cannot reject that this system doesn't have any sense. That is the perspective with which we are working.